Welcome to our session, which I'm very excited to lead. It's entitled The Transportation Revolution, a Game Changer for Real Estate. And my name is Dave Bragg with Green Street Advisors. We are a real estate research and advisory firm. We authored our first research report on the transportation revolution last summer, and since, we've enjoyed working very closely with ULI to build awareness across the membership base. And that effort led us to co-author the report that is in your hands today and also available on the ULI app for this conference. But the evaluation of the transportation revolution would be incomplete without the ability to hear from several leaders and visionaries who will help us bring this vision of the future to life. Our panelists will share insight from the perspectives of transportation and city planning, technology, and architecture. Together, they'll paint a picture of the current status of the transportation revolution and the hurdles that we should expect to encounter along the way. And the goal of this session is to provide you with insights and strategies that you can take back to your office and apply to your business. I'll briefly introduce the panelists, then I'll run through a few slides that pertain to the presentation that's in your hands, and then we'll come back for a lengthy Q&A conversation with them in which we dive deep into many different topics. At the end is Seleta Reynolds. She's the general manager of the Los Angeles Department of Transportation. In the middle, we have Debs Schrimmer. She's transportation policy manager for Lyft. And closest to me, we have Joe Brocanto, managing principal for Gensler, the design and architecture firm. And I'll give each of them a little bit of time to tell you more about themselves as we go. So over the next 75 minutes or so, we'll start with a brief overview to set a base case that will allow us to have a much broader and deeper conversation about the transportation revolution. I'll then kick off a Q&A session with our panelists, and towards the end, we will take questions from the audience. So we encourage your questions, and we'll save plenty of time for that, so please be thinking of them as we go, and we'll look forward to hearing them. Our perspective is that long-term growth is often overlooked, and real estate market participants typically do a great job assessing cash flow prospects over at least the next 7 years when valuing properties. But effort tends to wane on what might happen after that. And to some extent, this makes sense, as uncertainty in the distant future is very high. But one must consider that the value of a property 7 years hence represents about 2/3 of today's value. So thoughtfully derived long-term growth estimates are critical. And because issues that extend beyond that typical 7-year IRR window are often ignored, mispricing can result, and that results in opportunities. And as we evaluate those opportunities and we talk about what we think might be some mispriced assets and some opportunities for city planners and developers, we also must keep in mind that we should have humility when approaching a topic like this, because the final resolution that we're expecting is so far out and so many uncertainties do exist in the meantime. We approach this with humility, but we believe that the coming revolution in transportation is inevitable and powerful, and that for those that are on top of it, they can gain an edge in planning and underwriting. So we believe that it does warrant an incorporation into the investment process. And by the end of this session, we hope that you're able to draw some conclusions on the types of assets that might be mispriced today due to the transportation revolution, and the types of opportunities that you can find to apply this to your business. But we must remind ourselves that, for example, 20 years ago, Time magazine said, "Kiss your mall goodbye." They featured Yahoo on the cover, and if at that time you had sold shares in Simon Property Group, the largest mall REIT, and bought Yahoo, you'd be disappointed with the performance of your investment. So However, if you had bought Amazon at the same time, you would have seen a very different performance. So it's hard to get the timing right, and it's also hard to pick the right horse, but generally we want to highlight the direction in which we think things are headed. Please raise your hand if you have used ride-hailing, Uber or Lyft, this month. Wow. Okay, so that's nearly the entire audience, but you are early adopters. A recent survey that was conducted suggested that only about 20% of adults have regularly used Uber or Lyft. I think most of us here have used it this week. And the impact of this frequent use of Uber and Lyft is evident already in several different trends. For example, on the left side, you see that the propensity to get a driver's license, which has been in decline for some time, continues to decline as those aged 16 are getting their driver's license far less often than they did 30 years ago. Other effects include a decline in single occupant vehicle rides, led naturally by the city of San Francisco, which expects 40% of rides to be single occupant rides in 2019, down from 62% in 2009. If you look at other proxies for companies and industries affected by ride hailing, you'll find underperformance by shares of car rental companies and a plummeting of the values of taxi medallions in New York. So already we're seeing many different signs of the impact of ride hailing. And we're going to couple that with driverless vehicles, which are on the way. Who here has ridden in a car with semi-autonomous features, such as the Tesla Autopilot? Okay, nearly the entire room raised their hands for the first question. I'd say about 1/10 of the room raised their hands for the second question. And for the other 90% of you, I recommend that you check it out. It is an incredible experience to go test drive a Tesla, and they're not too pushy, by the way. You can just go into the dealership and sign up for a test drive, and your mind will be blown by the technology that already exists today. And I attended the Consumer Electronics Show in January and learned that the industry consensus is that driverless ride-hailing vehicles might be available for purchase in 2021, and driverless vehicles will be available for purchase then, and driverless ride-hailing could be available before that. But we have experts here that can help us with that outlook. There are many benefits to a future in which we have driverless vehicles, including driverless ride-hailing. They include safety. We have more than 40,000 traffic accident fatalities in the U.S. each year. After a couple decades of declines in this metric, it's actually rising again, unfortunately, due to distracted drivers. Human error causes nearly all of these accidents. Transportation costs, we'll cover in a second, is an opportunity, as is ultimately reduced traffic, but we might navigate a period with more traffic in the meantime. We'll see what our panelists say about that. Also, convenience. Commuters can be much more productive or relaxed as they're in their car. A lot of opportunities, but there's a lot of challenges. And the biggest challenge pertains to regulation, and we'll get deep into that during the course of this panel. Another one, which I haven't heard a great answer to yet, and I think is on everybody's mind, is security. And how do we protect against hackers? And a couple others that are very important and we'll read a lot about over the next few years would include social consequences. There are 3 million drivers in the U.S. That's 2% of all jobs. And as we see the threat of automation growing in both the white-collar and blue-collar workforce, this will surely be a bigger topic of conversation amongst policymakers. And then finally, technology. It's progressing very quickly, but there are still probably some hurdles that need to be crossed. Many driverless ride-hailing experts, including, and we agree with them, think that it will result in a big decline of vehicle ownership. And it makes a lot of sense. And we're not saying that everyone will forego car ownership, but two-car suburban households might be very likely to reduce their ownership to one car, and one-car urban households who tend to pay a lot for parking might be increasingly likely to forego car ownership. And this makes a lot of sense because car ownership is very expensive. It's the second largest household expense after our dwellings. And ride-hailing services offering self-driving vehicles are expected to be far cheaper than ownership. Also, driving to work takes a lot of time. 75% of Americans drive alone to work, and commutes tend to average about 26 minutes each way. So imagine if your commute could be more comfortable, less stressful, more productive, and cheaper. Sounds pretty good. So lower vehicle ownership should result in less vehicles in use. It might not result in less vehicle miles traveled. That might even increase. But if we have less vehicles in use, we should need less parking. And we have a ton of parking in our country. We have 4 parking spaces for every car. That equals about 1 billion parking spaces and 150 billion square feet of parking. If you add up all of the space in institutional, or in actually not just institutional quality, but all malls, all self-storage, office, strip centers, apartments, and industrial buildings, and then you triple that, you still don't even get to the amount of space that we have in terms of parking spaces in our country. So it's a substantial change that we expect to see. Some third-party forecasters expect parking needs to decline as much as 90%. Our thought is that a 50% reduction seems to make a lot of sense. I think we'll discuss some of the needs that we'll still have for parking in the future. And it's already time to think about the seemingly inevitable mass adoption of driverless vehicles, the impact that it will have on real estate. And a preliminary outlook suggests that for the majority of property sectors, the impact might be unfavorable. And we have heard solid rebuttals to some of our views, but I'll share the ones for which we have the strongest conviction right now. And that starts at the top with self-storage. As households see their ownership of vehicles decline from 2 to 1 car, they'll see a lot of space open up in their garage, which might not have a more natural use than for the storage of their belongings. So we won't be surprised to see households go to their self-storage unit, which is quite expensive, and pull the goods out and bring them into the garage. Next would be billboards. We don't look out the window very much when traveling by plane or train, and I would expect the same in a driverless vehicle. We'll be able to use our iPad and iPhone even more. Then on to low-quality retail. This could be the solution for the last-mile puzzle, and it could be a big tailwind for e-commerce. Some envision vehicles that run errands in the middle of the night for the owner. Commodity grocers and drugstores would be incrementally at risk in this world. Next, transit-oriented assets. Today, transit-oriented assets garner a premium relative to assets in the same market that are further away from the transit station. And that premium might always exist, or a premium might always exist, but that premium is quite likely to diminish, we would expect, as commuters could first get from their home to the train station in an Uber or a driverless Lyft, and then in the future they might bypass mass transit entirely. So a key topic for our session today will be the relationship between driverless vehicles and mass transit in the future. Next, we have industrial. Driverless trucks are also under development. They could result in supply chain efficiencies and improved inventory throughput. Goods should spend less time sitting in warehouses, and that might result in a bit of a drag on industrial real estate demand. But positively, the e-commerce related demand, which has spiked in recent years, should continue to rise. And then on to office. One thought is that offices in the central business district will benefit at the expense of suburban office. And that's because employees and employers will continue to prefer to gather amongst themselves to conduct business, and suburban offices will be a little bit less necessary given the ease of transportation in this future. This will also alter urban and suburban housing dynamics as well. And then the last one, which I'll cover with a different slide here, is high quality malls, but this really has relevance to any other type of high quality asset with a lot of land under it. Any well-located asset with a lot of surface lot parking surrounding it will see an opportunity for densification. And here we have two very high-quality malls. They both happen to be in South Florida. We grade all the malls in the country, and we rate both of these A++. And Ball Harbor Shops sits on 16 acres of land. Down the street, Aventura Mall, similar quality, similar cap rate in our view, sits on 100 acres of land. At the latter, there will be a lot of opportunity for densification. And you might ask, why are you talking about the need for more retail space nowadays? But that's not necessarily the answer. You could add hotels, condos, apartments, restaurants, movie theaters. There's a lot of opportunity at high quality malls, but also high quality shopping centers, high quality apartments with a lot of surface lot parking to add density. And we'll conclude the opening segment here with a little bit of a microcosm to show you what's happening already. Outside of New York City, it sits Summit, New Jersey. It's a commuter town, and they recently needed to build more parking at the train station. But the city of Summit decided not to. Instead of building parking, a new garage at the train station, which would have cost over $10 million, they decided to partner with Uber to subsidize rides for residents to and from the train station every morning and evening. And the implications for this program, which our understanding is that there will likely be many more like it in the future, are fascinating implications. A few things. Vehicle ownership in Summit is likely to decline because the household that has two cars, presumably one of which sat at the train station all day, every day, while the commuter was in the city at work, they might decide to forego continuing to own that car. The decision to not build the parking garage already results in less parking supply. And also, if they forego ownership of the car and the garage now has one car instead of two, that creates an opportunity for the goods to be brought out of self-storage and put into the garage. And then finally, how about the transit premium? Those who live across the street from the Summit train station pay a premium to own or rent their home. And that premium might diminish once commuters can take a very easy Uber or Lyft, especially one that's driverless and even cheaper. So this is a real tangible example of some of the implications that we should expect to see across the country going forward. So with that, I'd like to give the panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves, and then we'll jump right into Q&A. Joe, let's start with you. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your firm and what you're working on as it pertains to the transportation revolution.
I'm Joe Brancato. I'm a managing principal at Gensler, responsible for our Northeast U.S. offices and Latin America. We really do believe that we can improve the quality of life through the power of design, and certainly in so many of these urban issues, we feel that we can make a difference. This is a really exciting topic. It's an exciting time to be addressing this topic because it'll have dramatic impact. At a time that our cities are becoming denser and our streets are more congested, we believe the ride-sharing and autonomous vehicles can improve the quality of life in our cities. And so this is a fantastic topic. I appreciate being able to be part of this today, and really look forward to exploring the topic a little deeper.
Hi everyone, my name is Debs Schrimmer. I work at Lyft as an urban planner. I work on our transportation policy team, which oversees Lyft's impacts on the built environment, on our relationship to transit, on sustainability, and other initiatives. Lyft is a 5-year-old company, but we've actually been operating in the carpooling space for almost a decade now. Lyft was founded originally as a company called Zimride, which was really focused on creating long-distance carpooling options for students that were trying to get home over the holiday season. And with the rise of the mobile phone, our founders were able to leverage that real-time on-demand capability of a mobile phone and actually create a more on-demand service, which created Lyft. So for the last 10 years, we've really been trying to solve the same challenge, which is how do we reconnect our communities through better transportation and really challenge some of the notions of car ownership in our country. So right now, we're working a lot with cities around the country thinking about how we can fill gaps in a transportation network using our ride-sharing services today. But we're also very actively thinking about what the future of mobility is going to look like with the rise of autonomous vehicles. So I really want to thank ULI and Green Street Advisors for having me here today, and I'm excited to talk more about this issue.
So I'm Seleta Reynolds. I run the Los Angeles Department of Transportation, and we manage and operate about 7,500 miles of streets. We also oversee about 37,000 parking meters and 4,500 interconnected signals that we started building for the 1984 Olympics and remains one of the largest integrated traffic management systems in the world. So we feel like we have some very unique assets in thinking about how we are going to help ease the transition to driverless vehicles. Last year, around this time, we released a document called Urban Mobility in a Digital Age, which is the city's roadmap to autonomy. And it really does lay out short, medium, and long-term action items for the city and our partners to help nudge the convergence of autonomous vehicles, shared mobility, and electrification. Because if any one or any two of those things rises without the others, we're in for actually quite a bit of negative consequences. When you drop autonomous vehicles into a normal travel demand model, they reignite urban sprawl, they create an order of magnitude increase in congestion and in long trips. And so we know that from our role is to really guide the conversation around the public policy component and to think about the future of infrastructure and the future of streets. One of the other hats that I wear is that I'm the president of the National Association of City Transportation Officials, which represents about 55 small and mid-sized American cities and some transit districts as well, including Metro. And we're on the verge of releasing something called a Blueprint for Autonomous Urbanism, which lays out sort of some guiding principles for cities to be thinking about and also looks at the different components of the street of the future.
Thank you. It's wonderful to have all three of you joining us here today for this session. And my first question for the panelists is, it's a selfish one, but I think it is of interest to everyone here. So we're up here in downtown LA at the convention center. I live down in Orange County, and I'm already dreading getting home tomorrow. And I'm thinking through the drive, what time to leave, how about the traffic, and what would just be terrific would be to call a Lyft ride that is driverless and not that expensive and easy, get in the car, fall asleep, or get immersed in doing some work, and wake up at home. And the question for the panelists is, using your crystal ball, which is much more educated than any of ours, when do you think that will actually be able to happen? Seleta?
So first of all, if you wanted to get in an autonomous Lyft, not in LA, but in another city, and take it to a transit station, Dave, you could do that today. You could do that today, yes. There are Waymo and other ride-sharing companies have autonomous vehicles operating in cities right now, right? And so those are available now. In terms of what you're talking about, you frankly just described my worst nightmare, which is that everybody at this conference does that exact same thing, right? And so I don't think that, maybe that will happen. The magic year that I keep hearing thrown around is 2021. But then General Motors came out and announced that they're going to have driverless ride-sharing service by the middle of 2018. So who knows? But I think the real question is, how long will your nap be? Will it be a 12-hour overnight journey?
Right.
Or will we get it right and have a real conversation about things like pricing, both the efficiency of the trip and the infrastructure itself?
Okay. Debs, how about you?
I'm actually going to have to agree with Seleta here. I actually grew up in Orange County, and I'm very familiar with the 5 and the 405, and I think that the best way to get from here to Orange County would be taking Metrolink, which is the commuter rail system. So I would be really excited in the next couple of years to be able to take a Lyft to Union Station downtown. I think often we think about the exciting, shiny features of technology, but that's often abstract of the policy implications. And something that urban planners think a lot about is, even if you have self-driving vehicles, even if they're electric vehicles, an electric self-driving traffic jam is still a traffic jam. And so we need to be thinking about those policy mechanisms that we can make sure that they're aligning such that people are taking other options and not leaving behind things like mass transit. So at Lyft, we are thinking a lot about that, and of course we are working in the autonomous space. We have publicly said that our milestone year is 2025, and we believe that in that year we will be doing 1 billion, with a B, electric autonomous vehicle trips. Hopefully many of them are to transit stations and not these really long commutes that could be served by transit. And to Seleta's point, I think she's right. It's really, from Lyft's perspective, about this convergence of 3 distinct phenomenon. There's automation, electrification, and shared rides. And Lyft's strategy for autonomous vehicles is really that. In order to get the benefits of autonomous vehicles, we actually need people to be subscribing to a network and hailing a ride on an as-needed basis rather than owning their own personal autonomous vehicle. And we really need to be focusing on an electrification strategy rather than internal combustion engines. So I'm really excited for the next couple of years for us to get to 2025, when we believe that the majority of the Lyft trips on the platform will be serviced by autonomous electric vehicles.
So I didn't bring my crystal ball with me, but so I'm not going to give you a time or date, but I could tell you that this is not an energy transition. The whole idea of ride sharing and autonomous vehicles, it really is a technology disruptor, and just judging from what's happened in the past, it happens quickly if it's a disruptor, a technology disruptor. So I do believe it's a lot sooner than maybe most people may think. This transition, and so we're having these conversations, and we're actually designing buildings that are taking this into what the impact of the autonomous vehicle, what the impact will be on the built environment. So I believe it's a lot sooner than we think, and so I'm not going to give a date. I have no idea, but this is definitely a disruptor. It's going to happen quick.
Great. Well, 2021, even as an answer from one of our panelists, and then to think about 1 billion Lyft rides in electric vehicles by 2025, that's remarkably soon. So it's an incredible forecast that your firm is working on, Debs. And as you think about that forecast and that plan, what are the remaining key hurdles in the way that need to be crossed for you to get there?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because right now Lyft is a ride-sharing company. We don't have vehicles. We rely on a really fantastic network of drivers that own their own vehicles. We are really focused on the technology that powers that network to happen and to be able to dispatch rides and connect people to those trips. So we are very much beginning to transition from just the ride-sharing capability to a much broader fleet management of autonomous vehicles. So one thing that we really need to do is figure out where are these vehicles going to come from? What is the underlying technology that makes this possible? So at Lyft, we're actually taking a two-pronged approach to this. We have a lot of fantastic partnerships with private sector leaders that are working in the autonomous space. We have been working with Ford, Jaguar, Land Rover. We're working with Waymo, companies like Drive AI and Nutonomy. These are the companies that are really thinking about, what is the sensors, what is the mapping, what is the perception, what are all of the things that are going to be the brain of the autonomous vehicle, how do we get that onto the vehicle itself, and then we're able to bring our dispatching capabilities to be able to use our data of millions of trips and know how to actually dispatch and connect people to those rides. That's one part of our strategy, but we've also recently introduced something that we're calling Level 5, which is symbolic of the different levels of automation for self-driving vehicles, Level 5 being fully autonomous. And in Palo Alto right now, we're actually working to build our own self-driving system as well. So we're sort of putting eggs in both baskets by developing some of our own self-driving technology systems, as well as working with private partners. And I think that getting that technology right is going to be so important for us to hit that 2025 milestone, because it's one thing to be able to get one car to be able to drive an autonomous fixed route at low speeds, but to really get to that 2025 milestone where there's 1 billion trips happening, we need to be testing and scaling that operation.
And the 1 billion trips, would that represent all of your trips or a certain share of the total trips?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We believe that as ride sharing grows in popularity, more and more people are going to take this bet of realizing that, with transportation being the second highest cost for them, they can save a lot of money by not owning a car and just subscribing to a network like Lyft and being able to request those rides as needed, taking transit, biking, walking, being able to really right-size that vehicle with the need of that trip. And while that's happening, that's going to grow the entire marketplace of trips that are going to be served by Lyft. And what we expect to happen is that we will actually always operate a bit of a hybrid network where the majority of our trips will be performed by autonomous vehicles, but as the ecosystem for shared mobility grows, we'll actually be able to service more people through our ride-sharing platform. So we could really imagine a future where minors, and people with disabilities and seniors who really need that extra level of care and support would be able to use Lyft and actually get picked up by a human driver. So we could see that being a very possible reality.
Or even, I would say, women late at night, right? I mean, this idea that somehow there's never going to be a role for a driver in the future, I think, to Debs's point, is very important to unpack that assumption, because if you center your version of the future on your own experience, and you are somebody who doesn't ever have concerns about your own personal safety, or usually doesn't, and can walk through spaces and not be concerned about any variety of sort of safety issues, then yeah, no driver, no problem. But for women, kids, women with their kids, older adults, people with disabilities, that's never going to be something that feels comfortable, especially if we want people to share rides. I'm not going to leave the bar at 2 a.m. and call for a driverless shared Lyft, because I'm just not going to feel comfortable doing that. And I think there will be a need for a concierge in the vehicle too, because humans are not always the best behaved creatures, especially when there's no chaperone around, even after we're grown. I make this joke that the next time you're in a Lyft or an Uber, you should ask your driver what the craziest thing is somebody did in their vehicle, and then imagine what that would look like if there wasn't a human in the vehicle. I really appreciate that Debs is pointing that out, because I think it's critical not to overlook it, and the same is true of transit. I think there will always be a role for a human in the loop, whether they're actually operating the vehicle or they're serving some other function.
That's a great point, and I just want to go a little bit deeper into your last comment there. So it will be very important in many cases to have another person there, but does the whole system in the future work better if that individual is there but just not driving?
Absolutely. no
Yeah.
question. I
Okay.
mean, and you could even see entertainment companies or other folks who want to push content to passengers actually paying for those concierge services in the vehicle. You could see a future where the transit operator, I take the bus to work every day, or almost every day if I'm not riding my bike, and that transit operator does so much more than just drive the bus, right? They are your guide to the city. They answer questions about what stop to get off at if you're new. They give you a break on the fare if you're a nickel or a dime short, and you can plead your case. They help people with disabilities and moms with strollers get on and off the vehicle. So you could see that training in the future being about medical training, about conflict de-escalation, about a whole host of other skills that a transit operator might need to sort of run a system.
I think Seleta's absolutely right. And at Lyft, one of our co-founders, John Zimmer, he actually comes from the hospitality world. And he thinks a lot about what is that customer experience going to look like, and what things that we take as absolute central truths right now to the driving experience, what will look different in an autonomous future. And so we've been talking a lot about how might the in-car experience be different in an autonomous environment, and could you have sort of a car that is like a party, and you're having someone serving drinks, or you're watching TV,
Or doing yoga.
Yeah, like the possibilities are seemingly endless, and it's really exciting because the actual design of the vehicle might look different in the future when you don't have to allocate for a driver's seat, and those things start to look a little bit different.
Have you heard about that spin class in Boston that you can take on the bus? You get on the bus, you take the spin class, and then you get to where you're going. And so you could see that sort of, there's a prototypical,
Cool.
people are thinking about different ways to use that time.
Is everyone collectively powering the bus by spinning?
That is so visionary, Debs. I'm so into it. That's the next step. Next step.
So a key hurdle is regulation. And Seleta, could you give us a brief overview of the regulatory environment as it stands today? We all read about the various policies at the federal, state, and local level, but it's hard to put it all into context as to what that means for someone living here in town.
So I think in government, we are accustomed to thinking about our toolbox as very limited. There's the bluntest tool in the toolbox, which is my power to say no, right? And then there's regulation, which is my power to say yes and no, but mostly no. And then there's sort of a convening power of government. And what's become obvious to me, if you look at the AV bill that will be voted on by the Senate, likely to pass by the Senate, what's in it is a very, very intentional focus on lowering regulatory hurdles to innovation and automation, potentially, though, at the expense of some public policy considerations that cities have been trying to sort of put forward, things around safety and around preempting local control over things like speed limits and even over the cleanliness of the vehicle. The first version of that bill that was in the House actually would have ended up gutting the Clean Air Act, which I will set aside whether or not I think that was intentional or not. But it's very clear that the auto manufacturers have the ear of federal regulators, and they've been very successful at putting forward this notion that there is no way to marry good sort of common sense regulation with innovation. So at the state level, the California DMV actually comments are due today on their rulemaking around giving permission for driverless vehicles to be tested in California. And if you look at these two bills, you see that in the Senate, they have raised the cap dramatically on the number of vehicles that are allowed to be tested. Up to, right now it's about 2,500. It will be 100,000 per manufacturer allowed to be testing in the next couple of years. That's 1% of the vehicle fleet. That's not testing, that's deployment, right? Meanwhile, here in California, the DMV is trying to figure out how do we regulate whether or not there needs to be a person in the vehicle, and what does the permitting look like for testing. And then meanwhile, nobody can figure out yet how to pull over a driverless car. So think about that for a minute, Right? The DMV's got their thing. They're focused on, doesn't need to be a steering wheel or a human. How are we going to give permission? Then you've got the Senate saying, all bets are off. You know, we're off to the races. We're going to go as fast as we can. And then you got law enforcement saying, well, I'm giving the government salute, which looks like this, right? You know, not having any idea how to really attack this. So I don't think that the way that we're going to bring autonomous vehicles to cities is going to be in the way that we would like. And I think in the way that Lyft has definitely been a great partner and really articulating, singing from the same songbook that we are in cities. It's not going to be regulation. It has got to be some other mechanism and ways that we can find to do real partnerships and figure out ways to address both of our concerns. From a city perspective, the thing I most care about is retaining my ability to do things like set speed limits, to actually apply pricing, to price the trip based on how efficient it is, and also where it is in the network. And then to get some kind of data about what's happening on my streets, both from a safety perspective, but also from an overall land use planning perspective, to understand where people want to go, where the origin and destinations are, and how I can partner with the private sector to deliver those services better.
Great. And one more for you, Seleta, and then we'll move on to cover some of the applications from a real estate perspective with Joe. The response to the first question from Seleta and Debs really emphasized mass transit. And there was in the relationship that needs to exist between mass transit and driverless ride hailing in the future. A recent study by UC Davis indicated that consumers who are increasingly adopting ride hailing are using mass transit less. And we can only imagine what the consequences in the form of more traffic could be. So what are some of the potential solutions? How does a city nudge commuters to marry this relationship between ride hailing and mass transit when they might selfishly want to just go all the way from point A to point B in a driverless ride hailing vehicle? So
the work that UC Davis came out with looked at, I think, 4 or 5, maybe 6 American cities. Los Angeles was one of them. And it did find that a lot of those trips on ride-hailing services are coming off of bus and light rail, but they're actually increasing slightly ridership on commuter rail. The people using those services are overwhelmingly younger, very well educated, and in a higher income bracket. So I think the first sort of question for cities, especially like Los Angeles, is why are we in the business of public transit? You know, you've got, I think, 80% or more of the folks using transit in Los Angeles now are low or very low income. Transit is a lifeline service for, you know, millions of trips that happen every year. And it's not clear that these folks are going to be able to switch over to, you know, using a ride-hailing service to sort of make that trip. And so first and foremost, let's get on the same page about why we provide public transit. Second, let's be honest about geometry, because the most sort of precious asset we have in cities is space. And you know, Debs' joke about the, you know, autonomous electric traffic jam is a real thing, right? There's a grain of truth in that joke. And if we think about how we can move the largest number of people most efficiently through a city that is not going to stop growing anytime soon, it still has to be a trunk line rail system, right? That has to be part of it. And then third, from a real estate perspective, transit is incredibly powerful in helping us organize our cities. And Los Angeles is already a place that doesn't have a dominant center, right? It doesn't have a huge employment center that's in one place and then everybody else you know, goes out and scatters to the 4 corners. And so thinking about, you know, further sort of fragmenting that by sort of walking away from high capacity public transit, I think is problematic for a whole host of reasons around land use and development at the same time. So I think it is a combination of carrots and sticks. I think the carrots are that we in the public sector have to radically re-envision public transit. We have to change what we mean when we say those words. We have to change what we fund with those dollars. We have to think about how do we invest in companies like Lyft to make sure that they're serving the city in an equitable way. How do we bring together bike sharing, car sharing, scooter sharing, hoverboard sharing, hand to God, I got a call about that last week. So that we're not repeating the issue we have now with public transit, where we've got dozens of public transit agencies operating in a city and never the twain shall meet. How do we make sure we pull all those together so that in the palm of your hand, you can book and pay for a trip that feels seamless, that uses multiple modes? And they might all be delivered by 10 different companies, and that's fine. We need to be the concessioners of those services. We need to invest in them so that we set the fares and we make sure everybody, the rising tide lifts all boats. Those are the carrots, and they involve also redesigning streets and reclaiming some of this space to give back to green space, to protected bikeways, to wider sidewalks, to all kinds of things. But carrots are good for about 10 to 12% shift. Sticks are more effective for more like a 30% shift when you're looking at overall mode split and how do we move people differently. So I think we do have to have a very blunt conversation about how much parking we're providing, how much it costs, and when we're going to be honest about the way that we price the transit system itself. We don't price any other infrastructure the way we price transportation. Water and power you pay for as you use, and you don't expect your lights to stop working twice a day, but the transportation system fails twice a day because we haven't priced it appropriately, and there's pretty much bottomless demand. So when we think about, there's compelling reasons to make sure we get it right, but the tools that we have at our disposal are going to be enormously challenging in order to get that balance, to sort of nail that balance, and to make sure that we avoid that future, Dave's dream future, where he sleeps in his car for 6 hours and nobody's on the train.
So Joe and Gensler were kind enough to provide a couple pieces of insight on parking that are included in the presentation that is on your chair. And let's move on to that topic, because whether we're sharing cars or bikes or maybe even hoverboards, all of this leads to a future, we all believe, in which vehicle ownership declines. There are less vehicles on the road, and therefore we need less parking. So Joe, the question for you, with that future in mind, how would you build a parking garage today?
Well, can you hear me? Before we get to the parking, I just think about, this is all coming together at a really important time. What many of the cities are doing is they're looking at underperforming infrastructure to be able to convert, to make the city a little more comfortable, a little more livable. And I just think in a number, for example, in New York, it wasn't just getting, the flow was so difficult, whether it was vehicular or pedestrian. Now, I remember walking, if you walk through Times Square, you really need to get into you had to jump into the street to be able to walk, because the sidewalks are so crowded. And they closed down a few lanes, and just to accommodate the density, or the High Line, and a piece of infrastructure they converted. I just think that we're going to find this opportunity now that we're going to be able to take back the streets, where it will be a little more, a mix of the pedestrian, more walkability, bike lanes, maybe more areas that we're going to be able to make green areas to provide the relief that we need as the cities become more dense. So that's really, I see there's a tremendous opportunity that's already in motion. When we think about parking garages, which are one area, I just think this entire movement is really about creating a better experience for people. And where if you just think about a trip into if you're driving in, you enter the building through a parking garage. It's all about the car. That's all going to change. It's going to become more people-centric. You know, the front door will be the entry again. In the parking garages, there's lots of differences. There's a lot of different types of parking garages. We're going to regain some of that space. And as you know, we'll have to think about what to do with the existing garages. And there's different typologies, whether they're standalone garages or above-grade parking or below-grade parking. But as we look to new structures, we're looking at maybe more above-grade parking and trying to imagine what type of flexibility we can build in so it's easily converted at a later date as the parking declines. There's simple moves from an architectural standpoint, whether it's providing instead of increasing the slab to slab heights in the parking structure, or flat surfaces, maybe really thinking about pre-provisioning infrastructure, at least having the areas that you can provide for easy distribution at a later date of the infrastructure. And of course, really, how do people approach the building when they're using the autonomous vehicles? And that becomes a really big move. How do they queue up? What kind of great experience can we create as these people enter the buildings? Much better than coming through the parking garage and elevator lobby. That's not quite a lobby. It's just a way to get through and flow through. So I think there's lots of opportunities, and we're seeing it. We've actually been involved in a bunch of it, and it's really starting to change quite a bit.
Great. I have one more question for Joe right now, but after that, we'll go to the audience for Q&A. So please feel free to approach the microphone if you have questions for our panel. Joe, you mentioned the opportunity to repurpose parking, and surely every parking garage or parking lot has its own distinct characteristics, but what are some of the common ideas being floated around in terms of the opportunities for repurposing?
Well, it depends, again, what the typology is. If we're talking about a standalone parking garage, that may, if it has proper slab-to-slab heights, it could be, transformed into many other uses, whether it's office, potentially retail or F&B on the lower levels. You could think of it as well as education or residential. We've been involved in a project where we're actually designing and printing residences, and we have actually we've had it built in Dubai, and we're studying that now, studying how you stack it. But you can imagine printing a module and slipping it in, almost like a tray. When you're on the plane and you get your food tray, it's almost like a tray you could slide in. So really taking a look at how do we do this efficiently, effectively, to convert in these parking garages. I think in below grade parking that has less opportunity, but maybe it increases. There's more amenities that a lot of these office buildings are requiring. Seems like tenants are driving that, maybe not their own amenities, but the building amenities. And so maybe there's certain amenities that go below grade, and it could be that last mile industrial warehouse where there these parking garages are in great locations in cities where if you want to order something and have it to your residence or your office in 2 hours, it needs to be close. So maybe that last mile distribution, the parking garages at below grade, that we could start to see that.
Well, there sure is an uptick in demand for that, so that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Let's go to the audience for a question.
There's no microphone here, but I don't need one. First, a comment: the transformation that you are forecasting, which I'm totally for, I think the rapidity with which you think it's going to happen is highly problematic. Highly problematic. There are millions and millions of people who are more in love with their cars than they are with their families. And the notion that they're going to give up their cars in this transformation
I'll summarize that briefly since he didn't have a microphone. We started with a comment about car culture, which I think we all hear often. We have a big-time car culture here in the U.S., and individuals might be reluctant to give up their car. That's a fascinating topic in its own right because many believe that to get all of the benefits that could be achieved through driverless vehicles, we would actually need to outlaw driving at some point in the future. So any responses from our panel on that would be terrific. But the two questions related to the implications of this future on global warming and any ideas related to a cost comparison between, I guess, current pricing today and a driverless ride-hailing future.
Sure, I can speak first to the global warming question because, of course, it's something that is really important to be thinking about in the context of the greenhouse gas emissions that come from the transportation sector, in particular the light-duty vehicle sector. At Lyft, like I mentioned earlier, our strategy for autonomous vehicles is really about that intersection of shared, autonomous, and electrification. There's economic reasons why it makes sense for us to think about an autonomous vehicle fleet that's powered by electric vehicles because the operating costs are much lower than an internal combustion engine. But equally, if not more important, are those environmental impacts. There's research that suggests that if we deploy a model in the future of that shared autonomous electric vehicles, there's research from the Lawrence National Berkeley Laboratory that suggests a 90% reduction in emissions in the light-duty vehicle sector, which would be tremendous. Another study from the Rocky Mountain Institute that also looks at this model and what the environmental implications would be suggests a gigaton of carbon savings in a year. So I think it's really important for us to be, as an industry, really focused on not just the autonomous vehicle part, but the electric autonomous, the shared electric autonomous vehicle part. And at Lyft, we've really made that commitment by saying by 2025, we want to be doing 1 billion AEV trips per year. But we're not just focused on the vehicle itself. We're also thinking downstream about, what is the energy that's being provided to power that autonomous vehicle. And so, we're looking into what is the energy that's going to power that grid? What is the use and role of things like renewable energy credits that can power that? So I think it's a much larger conversation than just the vehicle itself, but how are we really powering transportation as a network?
So I think the question around greenhouse gas absolutely pivots on whether or not just an autonomous future, but any future is electric. And that's one of the most powerful tools we have to reach our very aggressive greenhouse gas emissions sort of goals in Los Angeles, and actually electric vehicles, and then second to electric vehicles is EV car sharing, which is another really powerful sort of strategy that we're going to be rolling out a huge EV car sharing fleet around the Westlake neighborhood in Los Angeles later this year and early next to start testing out that model and see where it works and how. In terms of a cost comparison, I wouldn't even, I'm not an economist, I couldn't even hope to begin. But I would say this, there was an article that came out this week about how if you drive fewer than, I think it was maybe 12,000 miles a year, that it would be cheaper for you to get rid of your vehicle and just use ride-hailing services. So you can already see that people are thinking through how what those cost comparisons are, even in today's world, let alone in a world where things are electric and autonomous. I think that again, that article, which is written by a great journalist, I'm sure, but one who was really writing from his own experience, doesn't take into account your needs if you are a mom with kids or if you are a caregiver for an older adult, and sort of what those needs might be. And I'm hoping that ride-hailing companies like Lyft are already thinking through those things and through those needs, but that those have to be part of the conversation as well. And then just to your question about the transition, yeah, there's no question the transition's going to suck. When there's 12 different autonomous vehicle types out on the road, managing around my Aunt Clarine, who is not going to give up her red Cadillac from 2005, and what that will look like as people become impatient, not with the autonomous vehicles, but with the vehicles that are not autonomous. And will there be a point where we will require vehicles to be outfitted with aftermarket parts at least be connected the same way that we smog vehicles now, right? So that's a whole huge conversation about the transition itself and trying to manage through it.
I also think that the more difficult it gets to move around with your own car, the more costly it is, the more time it takes. Things are going to change naturally. What we're talking about with, I just look at in New York. I mean, people that own a car in New York, on average, spend 74 hours a year looking for a parking space on the street. I mean, and it's costly. Parking garages are costly. It takes a lot of time. So this is, with this technology that we're talking about, things are going to get easier. People are going to see it. People are going to be leveraging it. So yes, there is a transition. There's a lot of 3-car garages in the suburbs and 4 cars for 3 people in a household. It's costly. It's going to change. They could use the money in other places. Even if they have it, if they can afford it, they can use it in other places. So this is happening.
Let's go back to the audience for another question.
Okay, in a dense urban environment, where will autonomous vehicles stop? And where will they go at night to park or whatever they need to do? And will that have real estate implications?
Yeah, the management of the curb space is going to be really critical. It's critical now. You can go to Hollywood on a Friday night and see what it looks like. It's very chaotic because we don't have a good inventory of our curb space regulations and we're not pricing our curb appropriately. I mean, we haven't even talked about e-commerce and what this means for e-commerce. But in terms of how we might, I think the curb space and management of that curb space is something that cities, at least from an ACTO perspective, are thinking about really hard, and about whether or not and how we're going to be able to do that and eventually price access to the curb. The second thing that's going to have to change, though, is the design of the vehicle itself. The vehicle now is designed for the comfort of the passengers inside of it. And you think about how long it takes me, even as an able-bodied person, to hoist myself up out of an Uber or a Lyft or a taxi when I'm at the curb space, and how long that takes, and how vehicle design might change, as Debs was pointing out, in the future, to accommodate both differing desires of what we do inside the vehicle, but also the need to very quickly load and unload at the curb space when it starts costing you money. And then storage in the evening, there's still we're not going to get rid of all of our parking garages. We are still going to have a place where we store vehicles, for sure.
But we'll be able to, since it's not an individual that will be parking the car in a parking garage, they're going to need the space to get out of the car. Cars are going to be stacked and in much tighter spaces. So we're going to need less space. Obviously, we're going to need charging stations and docking stations, but we're going to need a lot less parking even when we're storing these cars or charging these cars. But also, cars will be, there'll be more cars in motion more often.
Absolutely, and I think that the charging issue is something important to raise as well, because right now when we think about electric vehicles and the infrastructure that we've designed to support that, it's really around a model of people owning their own EVs and charging in their garage overnight using level 1 or level 2 chargers. But as we switch to this autonomous network where it's a fleet, the needs for charging are going to look dramatically different, and we're going to need to be able to really rapidly and quickly be able to charge vehicles so they can get back out on the road servicing trips. And so I expect that we're going to see a real need to grow the amount of DC fast chargers in order to enable that, and really thinking differently beyond this model of having a 9-hour charge in someone's personal garage overnight, because that's just not going to be the case when people aren't owning their own vehicle.
Yes.
I have a very specific question that maybe addresses some of those things. I represent a city called Shoreline, which borders Seattle. We are getting 2 light rail stations that are delivering in 2024. So that 2025 number is very important to us that you were mentioning. And part of the light rail stations, Seattle has basically outlawed parking garages by their light rail stations, but Shoreline has not. So we are the first, basically, 2 500 stall parking garages. And I'm beginning to think that we should quickly re-envision those parking garages to be A, only for all electric vehicles, B, have at least the top 3 stories be suitable for charging rideshare vehicles in the evening or off hours, and C, have a lot of that space be for pickup and drop off of transit riders rather than for parking itself, because right now we have a lot in the kind of traditional bus pickup and drop off, but we don't have as much for the rideshare. Any ideas that can help us address Metro and the Sound Transit needs and give them some advice on how we should move forward?
Absolutely, and we're actually already working with Sound Transit. We've received a really exciting grant from the Federal Transit Administration to work on first and last mile connectivity. So we've begun thinking about Seattle's context, but to your point,
Shoreline's context, yeah.
Shoreline's
Yeah,
context.
thank you, yeah.
right. I think what we need to be thinking about is an evolution of the park and ride model, because people won't be parking to access transit. And so a lot of the assumptions about how those facilities are set up are going to change. And Seleta's right, curb management is going to be an increasingly important part of that, because the curb space isn't necessarily designed to support rapid pickups and drop-offs, and what does the queuing or staging area look like for those vehicles. So I actually would say that we don't have the perfect answer right now. We're really at a moment where we're beginning to see a need to think differently about street space, and NACTO has been a fantastic design partner over the years in laying out those best practices with things around new cycling infrastructure, but we haven't yet seen the best practices for ride-sharing, pickup, and drop-offs, and I hope that in the future we can work more closely with NACTO to set those best practices for Shoreline and for other cities that are thinking about that.
I can tell you 2 short stories. One is about the Expo Line stations here in Los Angeles. And the Expo Line opened, Metro and cities put in a lot of parking around some of the stations, and people were very concerned it wasn't going to be enough, and it turns out it's too much, and it's not well used. So these are trends that are happening today. And the second story is about Mayor Reed and the Hartsfield Airport in Atlanta, and about how that airport was going to spend, I think, $80 billion on some huge consolidated rental car system and a parking garage. And the mayor decided to cut that project in half. For these reasons, they drove the foundations low enough so that in the future they can build up if they need to, create housing or create whatever else they want. But really, you're seeing, Atlanta, Georgia, saying we think we can cut our needs in half and do something totally different. I think that's a compelling sort of case for Shoreline to go back to Sound Transit and to rethink how you want to use that space and how you want to set it up so it's convertible in the future.
Thank you.
One quick one for Seleta that covers a couple of topics that we've touched on, and then we'll do one more from the audience, and then we have to wrap up. You mentioned at the beginning that LA has thousands of parking meters. There's surely revenue generated in a number of other ways related to vehicles. You mentioned the opportunity to perhaps price the curb. What is the level of conversation at the city level? What's the level of concern surrounding lost revenue as we think about this future?
Well, the CAO's office that does the annual budget is certainly concerned, because the meter revenue is about $50 million. The citation revenue is about $150 million, right? And if robots don't break rules, and we have a system where, the inventory is coded and your vehicle knows right away whether or not it's legal to park there, that's $200 million on an annual basis not going to the municipal budget anymore. And that's real money. And it doesn't go to transportation. That money goes to fund cops and firefighters and libraries and parks and basic city services. So there is a real compelling question about how we're going to change the revenue stream. And I'll put one other, so we've talked about pricing the streets, we've talked about pricing the efficiency of the trip, we've talked about pricing the curb. I'll throw another even further future-looking pricing mechanism, which is about airborne transportation. So once we have drones, whether they're mobility drones or they're there to deliver goods to your home, those drones will need to have a flight path that will be cleared by probably local government. And Amazon's not really going to care so much about how much it costs. They're going to care that they have certainty about how long it will take and how many deliveries that they can do in a given day. If there is a central air traffic control where all of these different companies are inputting, here's the trip I want to take, here's my origin destination, and then we are pricing, okay, well, if you want to do that at 5 o'clock at night, it's going to cost a little more, and if you want to do it in the middle of the day, it's going to cost less, but I can guarantee you a clear curb space and a clear flight path. That idea is also one that we're considering and sort of talking about. How do we build for airborne and then also earthbound? Everybody is going to need that same kind of back and forth with the local government about where the vehicles go.
Thank you for all of the questions. Unfortunately, we won't get to everyone, but we'll do one more right here on the left, and then hopefully we'll have a couple of minutes to chat afterwards. Please go ahead.
Should be real quick. Debs, you talked about Lyft is they're purchasing their vehicles and they're going to deal with the distribution of them. Have you looked into partnering with somebody like a service like Zipcars, where people can pool together and own a number of cars and then use a service like Lyft, or at least the software portion, so that it doesn't, it's a smaller group of people that own a portion of a vehicle, and they would tend to be more respectful of the vehicle?
Yeah, it's a good question, and as we think long-term about who actually owns the fleet, it's a big question, and we're talking a lot with the OEMs about that. But to your point around some of these other smaller fleet management companies, we've actually begun to test that already. Today in our ride-sharing operations, we have a really great program called Express Drive, which is a rental program for people that maybe want to become a Lyft driver but don't own a vehicle or a qualifying vehicle. They're able to work with us, and we work with providers like Hertz and Maven, which is part of GM, to actually be able to connect people to the right vehicle. So I could imagine in the future what you're describing being part of that as well.
If you'd like an electronic version of the presentation, you can find it on the ULI app. Please join me in thanking our terrific panelists for their insights.